Every 40 seconds, an American child goes missing. Every year, 840,000 children go missing in the United States, with some forced into trafficking. While many missing children are located within 24 hours, others are never found. Primetime television offers an ideal medium to present cases of children gone missing to the widest available audience. Kidnapping and human trafficking are federal offenses, so a program like A Place Called Home would be an asset for federal law enforcement agencies to notify a national audience about children who have gone missing. A Place Called Home will present missing child cases in both a documentary and docudrama format. The program reports on the brass tacks of the investigation by presenting reenactments of abductions and interviews with law enforcement authorities. To examine the pathos of the cases, interviews with parents and other relations will explore the emotional impact such crimes make on families. Missing children need our help, and A Place Called Home is the ultimate Amber Alert. As the producer and host of A Place Called Home, I am raising funds to finance the pilot. In order to present this work in its best possible light, we need production value. In other words, I can't just shoot it with a smartphone. The goal of my production company, Leader One Studios, is to raise $10,000 for the budget, so that networks will see it as a serious work and will be convinced that we are serious about finding missing children. Please donate to the show's Patreon fund at www.patreon.com/leader1. See the link below. Any amount will be appreciated, and you will save lives. Child victims of kidnapping and human trafficking await our efforts to broadcast their plight on a national stage. A Place Called Home, bringing the quest to find missing children to primetime television. Thank you in advance for your support. Welcome to Human Monsters. Transgender people have been front and center in the headlines for many years now. They have gained new rights, and their presence is no longer purely a source of punchlines and derision. Before this time, transgender people, particularly people now known as trans women, were customarily assumed to be mentally ill or drag performers. They were seldom taken seriously. One needs only to look to Monty Python's Flying Circus or the character called Cleaner in the series MASH to see how it was played up for laughs. Don't cancel Monty Python, yo. Psychotic illness can manifest in all sorts of bizarre and disturbing behaviors. A mentally ill man could wear women's clothes, but he could also end up dressing like the Hamburglar. It's not about the wardrobe or the manifestation of sexual characteristics. Psychosis leads to delusional thinking that results in behavior that makes little sense to people who are emotionally well. The offender profiled in this episode, Hadden Clark, has become known as the cross-dressing cannibal, and he was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. But the catalyst behind his drive to commit murder did not originate from gender dysphoria, and your average transgender person is not a murderer. The mental health care system failed him and his victims because it is easier to buy a gun in America than it is to get treatment for mental illness. It should be noted, however, that the patient needs to want to be helped. Just because you give a man a hammer doesn't mean he'll build a house. Typically, I don't waste my listeners' time with anecdotes from my own personal life. It's not a personality-driven podcast. I usually take a journalistic approach. However, in order to both entertain and inform, I will give you a thumbnail description of what it is like to have a psychotic episode. One day I was in a car with my mother and a family friend. We were driving down an urban highway here in Toronto called the Don Valley Parkway. Suddenly, I had a very intense urge to jump out of the car. I was sane enough to realize that this impulse was aberrant and irrational, yet it persisted. The best analogy I can give you is the idea to jump out was the female end of one extension cord, and the initiative to carry out the objective was the male end. They were coming dangerously close to connecting. My sanity and fear of the connection was my iron grip on both ends. I forced them apart and kept them apart until the impulse passed. If I hadn't, you wouldn't be listening to me right now. I would either be dead or I would be a quadriplegic. Through this experience, I learned how frightening it can be when you feel like you are not in charge of what goes on in your mind. That episode is long behind me, and I haven't had a comparable experience since. I am an epileptic, so misfiring synapses are a routine for me, so it wasn't completely surprising. Many mentally ill people are not lucky enough to realize when their delusional thinking has no basis in reality. One expert on mental illness noted that when a person has a psychotic episode, the same processes that operate while you have a dream during sleep are activated while you're awake. In dreams, you do and believe things you might not do while awake. But when you wake in the morning, you are your vintage self. While you have a psychotic episode, you are a dream self. But you may be surrounded by people who are thinking rationally. If you get completely lost in that dream world while awake, with no awareness of reality and no objectivity about how your actions come across to others, it can create tremendous problems for you. It can be difficult to maintain relationships and careers under those circumstances. Those homeless people who behave strangely and neglect all self-care, they are a hostage to psychosis. When psychosis dictates the circumstances of your psychological environment, if you will, holding down a job, paying bills, and other aspects of everyday life can come across like rocket science. People are conflicted about inpatient psychiatric hospitals. Some feel it is inhumane to house someone in one of those facilities. But is it humane to leave them to wander the streets in the frigid, cold winter, starving and lacking a warm place to sleep? Many homeless people don't want to stay in shelters because of the high rate of theft. They own very little and don't want to lose what they do have. It's a loaded topic, and you could debate for hours on either side of it. Hadden Clark was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is probably the most misunderstood mental illness. The word schizophrenic is frequently used as a misnomer to describe a person experiencing multiple personality disorder. Another misusage of the term is when it is used to characterize contradiction in emotion or perspective. An example would be, I have schizophrenic feelings when it comes to Dairy Queen. I would love to eat there every day, but I also enjoy being alive. This is a definition of schizophrenia given by the National Institute of Health. Schizophrenia is a mental disorder characterized by disruptions in thought processes, perceptions, emotional responsiveness, and social interactions. Although the course of schizophrenia varies among individuals, schizophrenia is typically persistent and can be both severe and disabling. I didn't bring all this up to elicit sympathy for Hadden Clark. It is the relatives of his victims who deserve our empathy. All I'm going for is edutainment. Thank you and enjoy the show. Hadden Irving Clark was born on July 31st, 1951 in Troy, New York. Given the conditions of his childhood, it is hardly surprising that the history of his mental health would not present with a homeostatic paradigm. His father, Hadden Sr., was a chemist with a stellar reputation. His mother, Flavia, was a homemaker. Father and son were differentiated nomenclaturally by addressing each according to their middle name. Names and DNA sequences determined the finality of their similarities. As time would tell, one could not have been inclined to designate Hadden Jr. to be a chip off the old block. Hadden Sr. was part of the team that invented Saran wrap. Fucking A. Like plastic wrap, Hadden Jr. would handle and store raw meat, but in quite a different context. Due to Hadden Sr.'s contribution to the food storage industry, he profited highly, and the family enjoyed a high standard of living. The downside of this upgrade of fortune was that they moved frequently. As a consequence, Hadden Jr. never established lasting friendships, and his social development suffered from the lack of long-term stability. It meant he was frequently thrust into the role of outsider. Those who adapt to the changing circumstances and learn how to make fast friendships prosper later in life when networking skills become a crucial aspect of success in their careers. Not everybody enjoys that fate. Others develop social anxiety. It doesn't help that the gaps in their social history leave them falling behind in their development as social beings. Fitting in is hard for most children, but when they are strangers and unwelcome by everybody who populates their new surroundings, integration and acceptance are difficult to achieve, especially for those who are introverted and unsure of how to make the first move. These outliers can implode and become emotionally and socially isolated. Their social skills become rusty due to inertia, and even looking someone in the eye is rarely achieved without some struggle. The latter was applicable to Hadden Jr., and he became buried in the quicksand of loneliness. Due to being mentally ill and cast out socially, Hadden led a troubled life from the get-go, but he was hardly unique in this respect among the Clark children. Brad, his older brother, struggled with his own problems. He was a drug user, having become an addict early, and by early I mean while he was on the cusp of adolescence. His substance abuse led to a great deal of aggressive behavior. His hair-trigger temper became so problematic while he was under the influence that on one occasion he took a gun and shot the window of a neighbor's car. Afterward, he said he did it just for, quote, the heck of it. As alarming as this was to all bystanders, especially his parents, the actions of Hadden Irving would make his brother look like Mr. Rogers in the long run. Rivalry is common among siblings, and when there is more than one male child, the older is likely to fortify his position at the top of the hierarchy with several low-grade tortures, most of which will be remembered with laughter with the advent of adulthood. Jeff Clark did not remember Hadden's bullying with amusement. Far from it. According to Jeff, there was always something askew about Hadden. He recalled that Hadden lacked moral scruples. He hadn't become demoralized through a series of traumatic events. He had never been in possession of a moral compass in the first place. Hadden seemed to be completely in the dark when it came to the notion that other people have feelings and that certain actions and words could provoke negative emotional responses, like anger and melancholy. Not only did he lack empathy and remorse, but he reveled in Schadenfreude, a German word that means to derive pleasure from another person's suffering. Hadden was so rough on Jeff, he frequently inflicted minor injuries with scars Jeff bears to this day. One day they were riding bicycles together when they both tried to master the skill of riding with no hands. Suddenly, Hadden put his hands back on his handlebars and deliberately swerved into Jeff's bike. Jeff went tumbling downward and landed face first on the pavement. Blood spouted from his face. He got no sympathy from Hadden. Hadden turned around and rode elsewhere, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Everyone in the family soon became aware that Hadden lacked the ability to distinguish between right and wrong, even with the guidance of his parents and examples of society, culture, and the media. One theory is that he may have incurred brain damage while he was born. His was a difficult delivery. The doctor was forced to use forceps to pull him out. He was injured by the forceps, but nobody could have predicted at the time that the neurological impact would result in schizophrenia and antisocial tendencies. Hadden Sr.'s disappointment in Hadden Jr. was obvious. He referred to his namesake as the retard. It became Hadden Jr.'s nickname. Its usage became so routine that Jr. would come to believe that it was officially part of his name. Sr. would occasionally spend time with Jr. Sr. was an avid hunter, and he would sometimes take Jr. on trips to the woods, where he would demonstrate his trapping techniques. At home, Jr. would test them out on rodents and other small creatures that visited the Clark estate. The traps did not represent the end of the animal's torture. There were no quick deaths at the hands of Hadden Clark Jr. He would delight in abusing these critters, savoring their suffering until they died. He did permit one to survive. He allowed a raccoon to live, and it became his pet. In fact, he trained the raccoon to accompany him on bike trips, holding onto his head as if it were a hat. Throughout Hadden's childhood years, he received inpatient treatment in psychiatric hospitals and other treatment facilities. The price tag for his father was considerable, but it was not money well spent. Junior's social skills never improved. His eccentricities and disturbing behaviors never cleared up. He was a lost cause. His only happy memories from childhood were his summers spent with his grandparents in Cape Cod. At the age of 19, the future didn't look rosy for Hadden Irving Clark. Due to all the time spent in psych wards, he fell behind academically, though he did manage to graduate from high school. His family could not spot even a glimmer of ambition within him, until he indicated that he wished to undergo culinary training and become a cook. His parents moved heaven and earth to get him enrolled at a highly reputable culinary school. Their personal and financial resources did not go to waste. Hadden was passionate about food preparation and was an eager and hard-working student. He successfully completed the course. Not only was he a good cook, but he demonstrated an exceptional talent for ice sculpting. Being adept at such an art would come in handy were he to be hired to work at high-end restaurants. His conduct was remembered favorably overall, though he did lose his temper with his fellow students and an instructor on a few occasions. Having seen restaurant workers in action and watched programs like Master Chef and Hell's Kitchen, I can't help but surmise that the food service industry is no stranger to temperamental people, so his anger was probably dismissed as an occupational hazard. Though Hadden was highly skilled as a chef and ice sculptor, his social skills still needed work, and due to his awkward interactions with superiors and coworkers, he was fired from one restaurant after another, never staying at one eatery for long. He worked in the kitchen of a cruise ship, which represented the longest stretch of employment in his record. Most of the line cooks were Korean, and they were not fluent in English. Due to the language barrier, there was no way for him to disagree with anybody. And since neither he nor they were likely to initiate conversation or other forms of social interaction, he kept to himself, and relations between him and his colleagues remained professional. He remained at the cruise ship for just over a year. Many changes occurred in his family's lives. His grandfather passed away and his grandmother ended up in a nursing home. Hence, the Cape Cod property was sold off, so there went his summertime solace. His parents separated in the late 70s and divorced in the early 80s. His father married a younger woman. Hadden Jr.'s life crash-landed due to his vocational and emotional instability. He wound up moving in with his mother. Flavia wished to help Hadden get his act together. She told him he could live there as long as he did some chores. Eventually, Hadden and Flavia began to bicker. Their disputes became heated, soon leading to violence. One day, Hadden beat his mother so badly she was left with no recourse but to call the police. He was charged with assault, but the case was dismissed because Flavia couldn't bring herself to prosecute her own son. Be that as it may, she could not allow him to live under her roof any longer, and he was kicked out. Given Hadden's struggles in the material world, Flavia often allowed him to sleep in a shed in back of her house if he had nowhere else to go. As Hadden racked his brains to come up with a way to make a fresh start, he opted to join the military. His family were all for it, and so Hadden Clark enlisted in the Navy. Though he was older than typical recruits at 29, there were no objections when he applied. He wound up working on a nuclear aircraft carrier called the USS Carl Vinson. He put his culinary training and experience to good use. In fact, his time on active duty with the Navy differed little from his time on the cruise ship. Relations between Clark and his commanding officers began to sour. Having grown tired of his disputatious behavior, they ganged up on him one day and locked him in a meat freezer for hours. Clark was soon transferred to a ship called the USS Theodore Roosevelt. Not only did his conduct not improve, but it got worse. One day at the end of his cooking shift, some of his colleagues jumped him. Amid the beating, his head was slammed against the deck. That's just what the world needed. Hadden Clark with even more brain damage. When asked about this incident years later, Hadden claimed the men were jealous of his cooking skills. Another delusion. Next, he was transferred to the USS Iwo Jima. His descent into mental illness was even more pronounced at this point, and his employment on this ship was shorter than at all the others. With one discriminating officer noticing Clark's mental instability, he ordered a psychiatric evaluation. After he was interviewed by a psychiatrist, Clark was found to be unfit for duty. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and was given a medical discharge. He received 30% disability status, which left him entitled to a small pension. Given his struggles to maintain regular employment, this stipend was a godsend, even if the amount was hardly what you would call generous. When Clark returned to America, his brother Jeff allowed him to live in his basement. Before long, Hadden began to run afoul of the rules, though it was not on the job or at home in Jeff's house. This time he broke the law. He got caught trying to steal women's undergarments from a store. His interest in women's clothing was not a recent development. Since he was a minor, he frequently wore panties under his pants. So much of his behavior was eccentric and transgressive that his family dismissed it as just another one of his quirks. Jeff and Hadden were getting along well, and Hadden resumed his career in food service by taking a job in a local country club. With his paychecks, combined with his military pension, he could have slept beneath a quilt of panties. Jeff was going through a rough patch, with his marriage falling apart and getting only partial custody of his children. After having been the bane of Jeff's existence when they were children, Hadden picked up his children for their visitations. He contributed money to the household and did various chores. They bonded further as they became aware that Brad's life was beset by legal, professional, and personal troubles. Then their father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He passed away in autumn of 1985. They further bonded after their father died. Hadden bonded so well with Jeff's kids because, from an emotional standpoint, he was a child himself, not just in the young-at-heart sense. His emotional age was at par, and they found in him an adult kindred spirit. But of course, unlike people their age, he could drive them places, and he didn't hesitate to do so. Among these places were stretches of wilderness where he took them hunting for rabbits. After teaching them how to kill the rabbits, he instructed them in skinning and butchering techniques. Was this inappropriate? Probably. Was he aware it was inappropriate? Of course not. His own father taught him how to do it. Eventually, relations began to break down between Jeff and Hadden. Jeff felt there was something inappropriate about how close Hadden was to the kids. They also bickered over financial matters. As far as Hadden's inappropriate conduct in the presence of the children, he was accused of fondling himself in view of the children. Whether he lacked an awareness of how this behavior would come across to others, or if he did it to instigate a sexual grooming process, remains unknown. These tensions reached a boiling point, and when Jeff became engaged to be married, he decided it was time for Hadden to relocate. In May 1986, Hadden was kicked out of Jeff's house. Hadden rented a room across town at the rate of $150. He resented Jeff for putting him in that position. He couldn't accept or understand that Jeff was preparing his life to make it more appropriate for marriage. Hadden took everything personally, and he held a grudge for some time due to this turn of events. Hadden wanted to take his anger out on somebody. He wanted to regain the power that was stripped from him. It didn't take long for Hadden to find a victim to pay a price for what had been done to him. As he was collecting the last of his belongings at Jeff's house before leaving for good, a little girl approached him. She asked him if he knew where a girl named Eliza was. He knew Eliza and had a sketchy idea of where she was. She was Jeff's daughter. Hadden knew the girl since she and Eliza spent time together during Eliza's visits. This girl's name was Michelle Dorr, and she was 6 years old. Given Hadden's childlike disposition, Michelle felt comfortable talking to Hadden. Children like adults who don't patronize them. They like to be taken seriously. Henceforth, they continued to talk. Hadden told Michelle that Eliza was inside and to go inside and see her. Michelle ran inside without hesitating. Hadden creeped quietly behind her. When they were both inside, Michelle discovered it was just the two of them. It was also soon revealed that Hadden held a knife in his hand. He leapt on her and pinned her to the floor. He took up the knife and cut her chest from left to right, over and over. She tried to fight him off, but he only retaliated, slashing in a frenzy. Soon she stopped breathing, and a large pool of blood spread out from beneath her as she expelled her final breath. Hadden was in a mad dash to clean up the crime scene. He mopped up the blood and put Michelle's corpse in a duffel bag. He threw the duffel bag in the back of his truck and sped away. He had a lot of mopping experience from being in the Navy and mopping up the poop deck. He must have done something right. Jeff didn't suspect a thing when he arrived home. It was only when Carl Dorr, Michelle's father, went over to Jeff's house to inquire about her whereabouts that everybody realized something was amiss. Jeff hadn't seen Michelle, and neither had Eliza. Carl canvassed the neighborhood to find out if anybody had seen Michelle, but nobody had. He went to the police station to file a missing persons report. Because he was noted as the last person to see her alive, he became a suspect. It didn't help matters that his marriage to Michelle's mother was stormy, with him threatening to deny her access to Michelle. Meanwhile, Hadden Clark was working a shift at the country club as if it were as normal as any other day. That is, normal except for getting stitches on his hand at the Veterans Hospital after work because Michelle bit him. Later that night, he drove Michelle's body to the woods. He dug a shallow grave and dropped her into it. Before shoveling the dirt back in, he hesitated, admiring his handiwork. He would later claim to have drunk some of her blood. He would later claim that Michelle was not the first little girl he killed. He has said that a year before he killed her, he murdered a 9-year-old female. That girl was allegedly dispatched in a similar fashion. A girl named Sarah Pryor went missing in October 1985, and detectives approached Clark to find out if he had something to do with it. He told them he was indeed the killer, claiming to have decapitated the child. He was said to have relished in the retelling of the grisly story. He told them he even ate some of her flesh. No evidence ever surfaced to confirm that he was culpable, however. The best lead in the case of Michelle Dorr came from a man who observed her in the company of a man on Jeff's property on the day in question. He described the man, and it was quickly deduced that it was Hadden Clark. Hadden had become a pest to his neighbors, so he was well remembered on that block. Police brought him in for questioning. June 8, 1986. The police asked Hadden Clark basic questions about him and his life, with particular reference to his time living at Jeff's house. He mentioned that he often roughhoused with Jeff's kids. The detectives showed him a picture of Michelle Dorr and asked him if he ever roughhoused with her. As soon as he took in the photograph, he began to fidget. He became so distressed he was on the verge of tears. It seemed for a moment that a confession was imminent. Hadden told them he was feeling ill and needed to adjourn to a washroom. When Clark returned from the lavatory, he appeared to have been possessed of a second wind. He was both evasive and calculating. They caught him off guard before, but he was ready for them now. He claimed to have been at his brother's house briefly, and that there was no way he could have done any harm to Michelle. His alibi held up, and without evidence, the police left with no other choice but to set him free. Though Hadden Clark would not be convicted for the murder of Michelle Dorr, he did run afoul of the law several times. Mostly it was for traffic violations, but in fall of 1988, he was busted for beating up his mother for the second time. His mother made the mistake of letting him stay on her property again. It was relatively free of incident until she caught him sneaking things out of her basement. She accused him of stealing from her. In response, he knocked her to the ground. He kicked her as she lay there. She reported the incident to the police, and he was charged with battery. He pleaded no contest and was given a year of probation. Hadden's legal troubles were far from over. His former landlord charged him with theft and vandalism. Clark failed to recognize his own accountability, and he became vindictive and hell-bent on exacting revenge. He accomplished this by killing their cats, spray painting their carpet, and planting rotten fish heads at different hidden locations around the house. He pled guilty for these charges and managed to avoid doing time due to his cooperation with the case. The sentence handed down was suspended. There was one condition of this arrangement to which he was required to comply. He was ordered to undergo psychiatric treatment. The judge had a look at Clark's mental health history and was compassionate enough to rule that his actions were the effects of an untreated psychiatric condition. The following was noted about Hadden Clark's entry into the inpatient psychiatric program. As soon as the patient was brought to the ward, he took off, was brought back by security, and had to be put in seclusion and restraints due to his extremely agitated state and ideas of suicide. Once he calmed down, he told staff about his ongoing dialogue with squirrels and birds. After Hadden was discharged from the psych ward, he got arrested again. He was rummaging through junk in the back of his pickup truck. He was highly agitated. Somebody reported it to the police, and they were dispatched to find out what was going on. When the police arrived, they ordered Hadden to exit the truck. They searched the truck and discovered a gross of women's purses. They asked him why he was in possession of all the purses. His response? "I'm a woman." However the officers felt about that statement, it still didn't make sense that he would own so many purses. One possibility was that he was a purse snatcher, though there hadn't been many incidents of such as of late. But there were identification documents inside the purses. It was revealed later that Clark broke into the women's locker room of a church and stole the purses there. He served about a year in jail for this. When Hadden Clark was released, he attempted to get hired in food service, but due to his lengthy rap sheet, no restaurant would hire him. The best he could do was to get hired at a bagel bakery to make bagels in the middle of the night. Hadden Clark was tired of spending so much time alone and decided to do his utmost to meet people and have a proper social life. He began to frequent a tavern called the Malt Shop. To his delight, he found some acceptance there. He became friendly with the bartender and the regulars. They thought he was weird, but colorful characters were not unusual among that crowd. Unlike most people he had known, they found his peculiar behavior amusing. For once in his life, he was accepted for who he was, much to his relief and satisfaction. Of course, he hadn't told them about his criminal history, which would have more than likely turned them off. Hadden was making more efforts toward living a normal life. He began attending services at a Baptist church in 1992. It was at this church that he met an older woman named Penny Hodling. She was looking for someone to assist her with heavy yard work. Clark was homeless and living in his truck. He was recommended to her by other parishioners. Penny was a psychotherapist and philanthropist who was always eager to help people who were going through a rough patch. She hired Clark without hesitation. At first, Penny was satisfied with the arrangement, but then she began to notice that some of her belongings were going missing from her house. First, a necklace disappeared. More disturbing was when she saw that her stock of panties was depleting. She couldn't bring herself to confront him at first, but then she noticed that her favorite garden tool went missing. She finally approached him about the matter and was as diplomatic as she could be. It didn't matter that he was in the wrong, and she was nicer about it than she should have been. He hit the roof. He was outraged at being accused of committing these offenses. In his warped and twisted view, everybody was supposed to accept his abuse and betrayal. Hadden Clark now began to plot his revenge against Penny Hodling. She still hadn't fired him, and of course he failed to recognize how grateful he should have been for this. She informed him she was going to be away for a week to attend a conference. Penny Hodling may have been a charitable sort, but she wasn't stupid enough to leave Hadden Clark alone in her house for an entire week, not without a stopover at Victoria's Secret on the way home. She got her daughter Laura to house sit while she was gone. Penny brought that latter fact to Hadden's attention, and the perfect plans for vengeance began to crystallize in his mind. Late one night in October, Hadden went to Penny's house. It was a night when he knew Laura would be on the premises. He went to a shed in back and retrieved a spare house key. Hadden went upstairs to the bedroom where Laura was sleeping. He swung the door open and Laura was jolted awake. To quote Prince, dig if you will a picture. Hadden Clark in drag. He was wearing a wig, a dress, and Penny's panties underneath. As if this wasn't crazy enough, he looked Laura straight in the eye and demanded she tell him what she was doing in his bed. Terrified and confused, Laura said, "Who are you?" His answer hardly brought any sense to the exchange. "I'm Laura." His delusional thinking was running the show, and he truly believed he was Penny's daughter Laura. His break from reality was so pronounced, he believed that the real Laura was a stranger, an intruder. Laura was so shocked she became deeply upset and began to cry. He wasn't finished. He began to admonish her for wearing, as he put it, my clothes. She was wearing only a t-shirt and a pair of panties. He informed her that they belonged to him. Perhaps taking a cue from her mother's playbook, she attempted to placate him by saying, "You're Laura, please don't hurt me." Apparently satisfied that he was assured of her submission, he pulled out a Bible and told her to swear on it that he was Laura. Pursuant to this, she was to forfeit her possession of her bed, the t-shirt, and the panties. Once she made the pledge, he ordered her to remove her clothes and take a bath. After returning from the bath, Hadden commanded Laura to lay down on the bed. He told her to roll over onto her stomach. He took out some duct tape and bound her wrists and ankles together. With her limbs restrained, he turned her over onto her side. He placed a strip of duct tape over her mouth. He later claimed that his original plan was to take her to the campsite where he had been staying. There was, however, something about taping the girl up that excited him, and he got carried away, wrapping the tape around her entire head, practically mummifying her with it. He left no spaces to admit a passage for air, and she suffocated to death. When she stopped moving, he realized he may have overdone it a little. He cut a hole in the strip over her mouth. He stabbed her in the throat, which he swears was an accident. He must have struck a major artery, for blood was spritzing from the wound like a geyser. It sprayed all over the linens until she bled out. Hadden Clark had experience at cleaning up crime scenes, and, given a week to do so, he cleared up the mess he made of Laura. He has said that after he finished the cleaning job, he sat and stared at Laura for, quote, nearly an hour. He insists that he did not defile the corpse, but that he did cuddle with it. Once Hadden was finished cuddling with Laura's dead body, he placed it in a large bedsheet, which was fashioned into a sling. He swung it over his shoulder and carried her out of the house to the pickup truck. He tossed her in back like she was fallen game. Before he left the house, he made sure to pilfer a few of Penny's belongings, like a pair of earrings, a crystal unicorn, and a camera. He took a moment to have a rest in Laura's bed before leaving, satisfied that he had exacted revenge against Penny for calling him out on his thievery. When Laura's brother Warren was notified that she hadn't turned up at work, he went out to the house to find her. She was not there, but her car was. He and his friend Rob went walking when Warren spotted Hadden Clark in his truck, who he recognized as his mother's gardener. He flagged him down. Hadden pulled over so they could talk. After exchanging a few pleasantries, Warren asked him if he knew of Laura's whereabouts. As the worst possible response, Hadden made a U-turn and sped away. Warren knew Hadden was strange, but this was not in keeping with his usual eccentricities. His behavior was highly suspicious. It is believed that this was the moment Clark drove off to bury Laura, since he kept her in the back of the truck. Hadden brought her to a stretch of forest near Interstate 270, close to where he had been camping. There, he buried her in a shallow grave. A little too shallow, apparently, for months later flash floods would occur and pry her hands loose from the dirt, making her discoverable. Penny and Warren went to the police together to report Laura's disappearance. When they mentioned Hadden Clark's name, the detectives heard alarm bells because they knew that name very well. They had a long memory for these things, especially when somebody is suspected of killing a child. They likely also remembered the time when he beat his mother. He had a history of psychotic illness and violence. It wasn't difficult to calculate that Hadden Clark was a danger to the community. Penny was hesitant to blame Hadden. She was willing to give him the benefit of the doubt and say that he was actually a mentally ill but harmless man, and that because he had never met Laura, there was no cause for him to harbor an animus toward her. Warren wasn't feeling quite so charitable, and he implored the detectives to follow up on that lead. He mentioned Hadden's odd and suspicious behavior when he questioned him about Laura. The detectives, too, saw his reaction as a red flag. The detectives advised Warren to contact Hadden and to let him know there was some gardening work for him to do at the house. Hadden responded to his voicemail an hour later. When Hadden arrived at the house, Warren did not beat around the bush. He insisted that Hadden tell him why he was so shifty when he asked him about Laura's disappearance. Hadden said he was scared that Warren and Rob were going to carjack him. The next day, Hadden sent the family a sympathy card whose message read, "Just please give me a call when you are ready to do some gardening again. I can bring some bagels on Friday, too." Efforts were underway to raise awareness about Laura's disappearance. Family and friends canvassed the community and posted flyers bearing her name and image. A distraught and emotional Warren even appeared on the local newscast, imploring the community to come forward with any relevant information. Hadden Clark was contacted by a detective and asked to answer a few questions. He wasn't charged with a crime, but he wanted to play it cool so that his behavior would not come across as suspicious. Clark told the detective that on the night it was believed that he murdered Laura, that being Sunday, October 18th, he was at his watering hole, the malt shop. He told them he drank nothing but coffee and that he drove his truck to a church parking lot where he slept until Monday morning. He gave them the story about his fear of being carjacked for acting so sketchily when questioned by Rob and Warren. The police found some important new evidence. One item was a pillowcase spotted with blood. The pillowcase was a match for some that Penny had in her home. The dogs sniffed out a bra, a silk blouse, and a woman's shoe. These articles were confirmed as having belonged to Laura. The police were certain now that Laura had met with foul play. Using luminol, they found spots of blood in the bedroom where Laura met her end. Luminol is a chemical that is used to coat surfaces to find traces of blood. Even if no blood is visible to the naked eye, luminol will pick up on residue of blood, if it is there. The bedroom was now declared a murder scene. The next day, the lab confirmed that the blood was a match for Laura's. Investigators and Laura's loved ones now knew that she had been murdered. A short time later, Hadden Clark was pulled over by police. The entire arrest was captured by a news crew who had been tailing them. Hadden hammed it up for the camera, collapsing to his knees and playing the victim role with hyperbole. Shouting, he said, "I'm so scared. Oh God, I just want to die. I'm just a homeless man. I don't have any friends. I'll be jobless after this." Under questioning, the detectives did not go easy on Clark. One of them said, "We found the pill case in the woods. It had a fingerprint on it. The print was yours." Their hope was that the confrontation would leave him rattled. He was indeed agitated, but he didn't confess. He started moaning and crying like a frightened child. The context of his words became less and less coherent. The detectives weren't about to let him get away with changing the subject. They demanded to know what he did to Laura. Hadden would only tell them he didn't know or didn't remember. He remained evasive throughout questioning. He was willful enough that at a certain point they were forced to pull away. They had to release him in the meantime, but not before obtaining a search warrant to comb through his truck for some incriminating evidence. During the interim, a woman provided a tip that a very strange-looking woman exited Penny's house on the day of the murder. Police surmised that this was Hadden Clark in drag. Strands from a wig were found at the scene, and they were a match for fibers found in Hadden's possession, so this became a vital clue. The fingerprint found on the pill case was a match for Hadden Clark. November 6th, police drove to First Baptist Church in Bethesda to place Hadden Clark under arrest. He was questioned again. This time the police were screaming at him. The evidence told the entire story, but he could have made everything easier for everybody by confessing, but he didn't. The police changed tactics, having Clark interviewed by female detectives who took a more diplomatic approach. This technique didn't work either, and he requested an attorney. The other detectives went back to intimidation tactics. They shouted at Hadden. They ridiculed and insulted his lawyer. They even gave Hadden a wedgie to confirm if he was wearing panties. He was. When he finally gave them some information, he told them Laura was buried on a property he lived on as a child in New Jersey. The police responded to this lead, unaware it was a con game by a madman. During his incarceration, there were moments when Hadden seemed to confess to his crimes. During a volleyball game, he said to an inmate, with tears in his eyes, "I shouldn't have done it. I shouldn't have killed her." In the meantime, he continued to give the police false leads, and they continued to follow up on them, only to realize they'd been had. Meanwhile, the Washington Post received reports about how Hadden Clark was being treated during his interrogations, which included not reading him his Miranda rights and honoring his right to have an attorney present. He was given the sympathy he had been hoping for. A quote from the article. "It is astounding that in this age of nightly repetitions of Miranda warnings on television, in both the police dramas and true crime reenactments, law enforcement officers in a place like Montgomery County would fail to deliver the caution. But they did. They also ignored the defendant's repeated requests to see an attorney. a failure that would surely sink any confession subsequently given. The average 10-year-old, we would guess, knows these rules. Hadden Clark's indictment was underway, and his trial was scheduled for summer 1993. Before then, he would boast that other inmates asked him for his autograph. The defense and the prosecution agreed to a plea deal that would stipulate that Hadden Clark be placed in a prison with a psychiatric wing. Penny Hodling signed on to the agreement. Despite what he put her through, she still felt strongly that he was a sick man who was in need of treatment, and that a purely punitive approach to his incarceration would likely only exacerbate his condition. This is the official confession given by Hadden Clark and drafted by his legal team. During the early morning hours of October 19, 1992, I entered the home of Laura and Penny Hodling. I found Laura alone in her bedroom. I killed her by means of suffocation while she lay there in bed. I moved her from her home and buried her. I was not assisted by any other person and suffered no delusions at the time of this crime. I committed the crime of my own free will. I profoundly regret any actions and wish to extend my deepest sorrow and regrets to the family of Laura Hodling with all my heart. I am pleading guilty because I am guilty and for no other reason. Hadden revealed the truth about the location where he buried Laura's remains. Her body was retrieved. Penny and Warren said it brought them some closure. One of Hadden's attorneys, John Monahan, issued this statement regarding Hadden's crimes. In Hadden's crazy, mixed-up world, Penny became a replacement for his mother. When Laura came home, there was a reason, obviously misguided, that he discerned as a threat to this relationship, and that is why he did what he did. Quickly said, this explanation may cause two mothers in the courtroom to start to blame themselves. He doesn't want this, and we certainly don't. The guilt for what happened to Laura Hodling is with Hadden Clark, and not with Penny Hodling, and not with Mrs. Clark. It would be awful for them to continue to blame themselves for what he did. Sentiments like this were written and read aloud in hopes that the judge would go easy on Hadden. She did not. When it came time for sentencing, she looked him right in the eye and said, "You have taken Laura Hodling's life in the cruelest way. You pose a great danger to society. Having considered all the previous extensive psychiatric treatments and their inability to help you, I will not refer you to Patuxent Institution for treatment. You may petition for admittance on your own. It is the sentence of this court that you be remanded to the Department of Corrections in a maximum security facility for 30 years. And it is the hope of this court that you serve every day." Michelle Dorr's remains were finally located, and she received a proper funeral and burial on January 15th, 2000. Hadden Clark remains in prison. Efforts to charge him with the torture and death of Michelle Dorr are still ongoing. Was mental illness truly to blame for Hadden Clark's crimes? It was his responsibility to undergo treatment and take medication to suppress the symptoms of schizophrenia. It is the responsibility of all those who have the condition to do so. By having been so irresponsible, he put himself in the position of being driven by disordered and delusional thinking. Another thing is this. My friend Glenn Malone was a psychiatric social worker, and he has said that just because you have a mental illness doesn't mean you don't also have a personality. Hadden Clark knew what he was capable of, but chose not to manage his illness so that nobody would get hurt. In that regard, his choices and actions were deliberate. My first guest is Amelia McKenzie. She works at a psychiatric facility in Scotland, and she deals with people who have schizophrenia all the time. And she enlightens us about the condition itself and about the lives of her patients. I'd like you to start by telling us about your background in mental health care and about the institution where you currently work.
So I started off in mental health in 2012, and I was in the community. It was a supported accommodation, and it was mental. It was guys who had been long term in mental health hospitals, and our role was to support them to get the skills to go back into the community. The majority of them were schizophrenics, well managed, and we would give them like skills like accessing doctors, budgeting, preparing food, things like that. Everything they needed to go and live on their own. And a housing support team would then take over once they were settled back into the community. And then I went from there into the NHS, and I'm now in an acute mental health admissions ward where we get them when they come in at their worst and try and get them back into the community or back into rehab, depending on their situations.
Okay, and I was wondering, does Scotland have a homeless problem like we have here in North America, where there's so many there's so many mentally ill people who wind up on the streets because they haven't gotten the treatment? Is that something that has been able to happen there, or is it optional for them to get treatment?
It's absolutely a massive problem, and more because they can't manage their lives. If they start withdrawing from treatment, they can't manage their normal lives. They lose their homes, they disengage with services, and they end up on the streets. And you see them on the streets, and you don't know, are they under the influence of drink, alcohol? What's put them there? And the services, because they've disengaged with any services, they kind of fall under the radar again, and then it becomes it is a big issue, especially in the bigger cities.
Yeah, and there is the age-old question too, of they used to say, well, it's inhumane to put them in an institution, but how humane is it to let them shiver out in the frigid cold on the streets and struggle to get food and shelter? So, I mean, which is worse,
And we get them in the hospital, and there is some people who have been in there so long, they are institutionalised, and they're never going to move on because they don't know anything else. Whereas now, what we try and do is get them in, get them well, and back into the community as soon as possible, where they can be managed with the community mental health team, their community nurses, and they're kept sort of stable once they're well. Then if they go back out and they start taking drugs again, that's when it's all slips.
Are they able to get access to free psychiatric drugs when they're back out?
Yeah, definitely. What usually happens when they go back into the community once they're well is they get a depot injection, which is every 2 to 4 weeks. And the good thing about the depot is they're not forgetting to take their tablets, because this injection does it all for them. It also means that the community team are visiting them every 2 to 4 weeks to administer this injection. So that's quite a positive thing for them once they're back in the community.
And in terms of long-term success, like someone who manages to stay on the straight and narrow for, like, say, 10 years or so, and now they've got long-term employment, and maybe they're married, or all these things that we associate with having a normal life. What would you say is the success rate in terms of that? Like, what percentage of them manage to achieve that much normalcy over a long period of time?
Unfortunately, it's it's not a great deal, because a lot more who are coming through the system are drink, alcohol, drug-related schizophrenia. So when they go back out, although we're giving them their depot and we're keeping tracks on them, they're also taking street drugs. They're abusing their bodies. So we've seen the same people come back time and time again. And although they are being seen in the community every 2 to 4 weeks, they've got the extra sort of stressors, and they take the drugs, they take the alcohol. So yeah, we don't have a great success. Sort of, they do. We have some that will go on and live a normal life, but it's not a high percentage anymore.
So does even marijuana counteract the effects of the psychiatric medication?
Definitely, yep. And it also adds to their paranoia, which is then they'll get paranoid about taking their depot. So they'll stop answering the door, they'll disengage with services.
Yeah, I used to know someone, she has a child, but her life is in disarray because she's schizophrenic and taking the medication, but she smokes pot like a chimney, and just, the child's been late for school. She hasn't taken the child to school for a long time. Her apartment is a mess. Mm-hmm. And her mother and her stepfather are trying to get the courts to force her to get off it, which is not easy because in Canada now, marijuana is legal. So that's another challenge there. But yeah, she just thinks that she can manage it taking both, but she can't.
And again, that's another problem, is that people, they become so unwell. They don't know that they're unwell. To them, that's their normal life. So I never slept last night, so I'll have a couple of joints today and I'll maybe sleep better. And it just impacts on everything.
Yeah, marijuana is not addictive like heroin or cocaine, but it is addictive in a way, isn't it?
It's got that psychological addiction, I think, that they feel they need it to get that sleep, to get that relaxation. Their mind can't turn off, so I'll have a joint and I'll maybe calm down a wee bit, I'll chill out and relax. And then it's just just has a knock-on effect on everything.
Do you have a problem in the facility you work in with patients trying not to take the medication or sneaking away and somehow, tongue it up to the roof of their mouth and spitting it out? Is that a problem there?
Every day. They'll come, we'll give them their medication. They can take a full glass of water with their medication and still have it hidden. And it's not until we do a room search that we're aware of the fact that this has happened. We've also, because it's a hospital and they do have what we call timeout, so it's unescorted, timeout in the grounds, they'll meet the drug dealer. They'll come back, they'll have had drugs. And they've had drugs because they'll refuse to give you a urine sample. And the type of unit we're in, we can't force them to give a urine sample. So if there's nothing to hide, they'll give you. If they are hiding it, but because we don't know what type of drugs they're taking, it reacts with their antipsychotics. And again, things like energy drinks. They'll go to the shop and buy energy drinks, and that again reacts with everything.
Oh, even that. It's like Red Bull. They drink Red Bull and eat that. Yeah, wow. So what is the common issue that brings them to the point where they have to go to an inpatient facility for a while? Is violence a big part of it?
Surprisingly, it's not so much violence. That's like one of the myths that schizophrenics are really violent. They're more likely to harm themselves than what they are others. Although we do have some sort of forensic violence patients, a lot of it is because they have a recall because they've disengaged with services. So we'll recall them back, and the police will bring them back in. You have others who they'll have suicidal tendencies because they can't cope with what they're going through, and that's a big thing. So they'll present themselves to A&E saying that they're suicidal, they need help, and it's just because they can't cope with what's going on in their own head. Or they'll, the other day, putting on Facebook, "I've had enough."
Yeah.
And it was enough to sort of trigger family and friends into contacting the services, and that recalls them back in as well.
Are there any job creation programs, perhaps created by the government or any other organization, to help them get employment, which is considered to be a step toward recovery?
There is. We do have a rehab unit where they'll go there, and the aim is that other organisations will take over a lot of their treatment, and they'll take them out and they'll give them not so much employment but skills to get employment, gardening, all these. And it's not just for employment, but it's more for mixing with other people, learning how to have sort of discipline that you would get in a job. We don't have as much like, this is you're going into the community and we have got you a job sort of thing.
Oh yeah, so not a job placement, just kind of helping them with their resume, that kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but then you have another challenge because, as someone who's had their own mental health problems as I have, sometimes work can be stressful. There's also the fish out of water syndrome. People who have mental health issues sometimes had difficulty adapting to like a 9-to-5 job where, everything must be done this way and that way. Everything's in black and white. Is that something that becomes problematic for them at some times?
It becomes problematic, even in the hospital, even trying to get them up in the morning. And we try and have like a structured ward, whereas we get them up. You've got breakfast, you've got your room clean, your bed making, things like that. So we're trying to structure them before we move them on, and it can be very, very difficult just to put that structure in. They can't cope with it. They find it hard to be motivated to do stuff. All they're interested in is sleeping, going out and having cigarettes, and having their meals, basically.
Yeah, it's just kind of drifting, I suppose, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, they had this acronym in England, NEAT, not in education, employment, or training. Is that, I guess you could apply that to a lot of mentally ill people as well?
Yes, and the majority of our patients, when they're admitted, they are unemployed, and they'll continue to be unemployed for a long time. That maybe some of them have had employment in the past, but they can't hold a job down just because of their lifestyle.
Yeah, and there's also a whole thing about how, employers, if they take a look at your resume and see that there's gaps in the work history, that's a major concern for the mentally ill person, because they want to be able to explain it, but they're worried about how the person interviewing them is going to feel about it, because prejudices can come to the fore. So that must be a big problem too, discrimination.
Yeah, I mean, we've got the equal opportunities, and you shouldn't be discriminated because you've been in a psychiatric unit, but you are. You most definitely are. From an employer, somebody who will be as if someone's open and said, "I've been in a psychiatric unit, I suffer from schizophrenia," they're not supposed to, but they will take them off the short list. It's because again, and I think a lot of that is because of the myths and the beliefs that schizophrenics are violent, they're split personality, all the things that aren't true.
Well, yeah, what would you say are some of the myths and misconceptions about schizophrenia that people tend to believe?
The split personality, that's a big one. There's no such thing as a split personality. They think that, because when they're talking to you and they come away with things that's sort of this mumbo jumbo. So people think that that's another person, that they're talking, it's two different people, but it's not. This is like their voices projecting. And to them, these voices are as real as what this conversation is. The violence thing, again, it's like I said, they're more likely to be harm themselves than what they are harm the nurses, the nursing staff. So we do have some, when they become really, really unwell, they become aggressive. It can be managed. Sometimes it does need restraint, but it can be managed. But they're not likely to just be walking down the street and attack someone. It's very highly unlikely that happens.
Yeah, I've read they're more likely to be the victims of violence. Have a lot of your patients been attacked?
No, we've had a few incidents, but nothing too severe. And it normally starts over petty arguments and not really a lot of their illness.
And is there ever violence on the ward among patients or towards staff?
There can be. More with those who've actually got a violent background before they were even ill. So they've maybe got domestic abuse before they become unwell in their history, or they've had assault charges, but while they were well, those are the ones that are more likely to be aggressive when they're unwell.
Mm-hmm. Have there ever been suicides on the ward where someone managed to carry it out?
Yeah. We have had a few suicides. Not so much with the schizophrenia, but those who've got personality disorder. It's not so much suicide; it's misadventure. They've just went too far with self-harming. Schizophrenics are more likely to, in my sort of experience, they're more likely to jump off a bridge because the voices will tell them that that's what they've to do. That's the only way they're going to get rid of it. So that's a suicide. The other ones are more misadventure.
And considering that schizophrenia is treatable with chemicals, with medication, other psychiatric conditions are not always treatable that way, right? Like borderline personality disorder. That's something I heard there's a documentary I saw where a woman said that's considered like the fatal disease in mental health care because it's untreatable.
To a certain extent, because borderline personality, you can become really depressed. Sometimes we'll use ECT, which is an absolutely, although it was barbaric at one time, it's now very effective, and we still use that here. And it does, because of the borderline personality, if their moods they can become really, really low. So we'll use the ECT. It sort of stabilizes them again. A lot of the time, it's cognitive behaviour therapies that they use to try and work out what's their trigger, how they're going to manage it, what they're going to do the next time they feel like self-harming.
Yeah, but then you have the problem too of like when it comes to something like anxiety, when you throw logic at it, it doesn't stick. At least I find that's true. It's like I can read about the causes or rational arguments against it, but yet in some cases it's so deeply rooted, it just doesn't respond to that. So how do you counteract something like deep rooted psychological problems like depression, anxiety, perhaps due to trauma? That's a different kind of challenge. Pills don't make it go away. How do you uproot that sort of thing?
Well, we do. We still use medication for their anxiety, something that can calm them down. We spend a lot of our time talking to our patients, trying to get to the bottom of what's brought this on. And if you can get to the bottom of the trauma, a lot of it is trauma. If you can get to the bottom of the trauma, then it can be passed on to the medical team. They can put therapies in place. There, we do have quite a high success rate. But it's getting to the bottom of what started this. What was your root cause? And now how can we deal with it? Counselling, it's an amazing thing. No, it doesn't work for everybody, but we do have a great success rate where EUPD, sort of your emotional unstable personality disorder, we have quite a good success rate there.
How many patients would you say experienced child abuse as a cause of much of this?
Oh my goodness. If you go back records, you will find that the majority of people with mental health has come from some sort of childhood trauma, whether it be abuse or they were brought up in a family where there was a dysfunctional family, drugs, alcohol, schooling was a problem. And then things like ADHD are also a factor that wasn't picked up at school, so they went off the rails. So yeah, there is a lot of childhood, and 90% of the patients have had some sort of childhood trauma.
Yeah, I mean, does it take? It seems like it takes a lifetime to, or maybe there is no going back with that. Is there? There's no. Can you really cure that kind of trauma? The effects of it. It seems like it's can't be undone, can it?
No, it can't be undone, but there can be ways to manage it. Yeah. Just getting the patient to see those ways and getting their safety plan, what they're going to do, put it back onto them so that we're not managing it for them. It's how they're going to manage. How are they going to manage when they go home and they've not got a nurse 24 hours a day? Yeah. So you have to put it back to them. So there's a lot of sort of safety planning involved. And like I say, we have patients coming back and we see them a few times, and it's because they didn't use their safety plan. They had it in place and then they couldn't use it. So then you have to explore other options. So what would we do different? How would you manage that different?
Yeah, I see. And, you know, one thing I read that's really interesting about people with mental illness, someone said they're the most genuine people I've ever met. Have you found that to be the case with them?
Yeah, they are. And when our patients are admitted, and sometimes they are absolute nightmares. They're so unwell that you could just choke them sometimes. And as they start getting better, and their real personality comes back out, and you find they're such nice people. And you're like, my goodness, what a difference 6 weeks or 10 weeks has made. Some of them are still quite vulnerable, but they are the difference between them being admitted when they're just at that crisis point to ready to go back home. It's amazing.
Yeah, and they're always very interesting, aren't they? As individuals, yeah.
And we have a lot of people come in and they've got they've got delusions of grandeur. They've got this, they've got that. They think they're better than anyone else, and or they've got these sort of fixed false beliefs that they're head of the NHS or they're head of this department, and then it doesn't matter what you say to them, they will never believe that they are not. And then they get well, and you think you see them and they're back to the normal people, and you can actually talk to them and find out what they really do and what they really are.
And when they do achieve that clarity, how do they tend to feel about how, you know, what they were going through, how they were behaving, how they were thinking? Do they feel shamed, embarrassed, or how do they feel? Yeah.
A lot of them can't actually remember what they were like when they first come in. But some of them can, and they'll be really embarrassed about the way they behaved, the way that they lashed out, the way that they spoke to you. The fact, like one woman, the fact that she'd wet herself and she was under a restraint, and she's so embarrassed about this because she would never have done that, and it's the wee things start to come back to them. But a lot of them cannot remember, and they can't even recall coming into hospital.
Wow. Yeah, I remember reading about this person described what goes on inside the brain while a schizophrenic is having a delusionary state or a psychotic episode. They said that it's like the same processes that are at work in your brain while you're having a dream, while you're sleeping, are activated while they're awake. And they don't realize that none of it's real. Is that how it goes?
Yeah. We done a training course, and part of it was, so one person sits in a chair, somebody else sits in front of them and has a normal mundane conversation. What did you have for your dinner last night? Did you watch anything good on telly? What are you doing tomorrow? So a normal conversation. And on the left-hand side, you had somebody whispering in their ear negative things like, look, she said that your hair is absolutely horrible. She doesn't like your trousers. And on the other side, you have somebody putting positive words in. Oh, look at her. Doesn't she look nice today? Or she really likes you. And that's how a schizophrenic's got to deal with. They've got voices coming in both sides. They're still trying to have a conversation with you and ignore what is going on. And it was actually a really interesting experiment. It gave you a sort of bit of insight, so that when you are talking to somebody who's experiencing hallucinations, and that you know that they've got other things going on in their head, so they sometimes feel a wee bit that they'll look at you, and you know that they're no actually focusing on what you're asking them. So it's a really interesting tool for anyone to use.
Yeah, and then there's also this ethical dilemma that comes up. This is in criminal cases where a schizophrenic did commit an act of violence. Basically, a judge might say, well, it is true that you were diagnosed with schizophrenia, but on the other hand, it was your responsibility to take your medication, to undergo treatment, so you are going to prison, which, of course, is not going to be good for the schizophrenia. So, where do you stand on that issue, the whole issue of responsibility?
It depends really how unwell they were. We have units that are, a lot of your prisons will probably have, they do have mental health people in them, but we have a unit especially for that type of patient. And obviously we've got low, medium and high secure units for those type of patients that they're too unwell to go to prison, but they still need to be treated and kept locked up. There is always the onus that they were responsible for taking their medication, but if you become unwell, you don't take it. It's one of the things that's always going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. And how many of these patients are in touch with their families, or have they been written off by them?
I'd say at the moment, 50-50. Again, a lot of our patients are the younger generation, and a lot of their families also suffer mental health.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
It's sort of, you've got that genetic component there. So the families can't support the patients because they're going through their own stuff. So yeah, that's quite, so I'd say about 50-50 at the moment.
Yeah, I remember I saw this documentary about how trauma can alter your genes and the offspring can inherit that trauma. And when you consider all the events historically of the 20th century, how 100 years ago there was much worse poverty and human rights violations than there is today. There was World War I, World War II, and so that carries on to the subsequent generations. So, and my girlfriend who used to work at a mental health facility says that nevertheless the younger ones are the ones who have the most hope of recovery. Have you found that to be the case?
Oh, well, I would like to say yes, but it's the younger ones that we see coming back, because the younger ones now are, they're the ones that will go back, and the drugs are more available now. So yeah, we get them well. Yeah, we put them back into the community. They'll take their depot injection, but they'll also take drugs, and that's the younger generation now. Whereas the older ones are more institutionalised, because we didn't put them back into the community years ago. We kept them.
Oh yeah. Well, I know that one thing that they've complained a lot about is the side effects of the medication. Has that gotten better? Are the medications, they still have the same side effects, like in terms of making them sluggish and that sort of thing?
Their antipsychotic medication, I don't think that's as much what makes them sluggish. I think it's the things that they take along with it. So because they're not able to sleep, we'll give them sleeping tablets. They're anxious, so we'll give them diazepam, and seems to have the sort of sluggish effects. The depot injection doesn't have this sort of same side effects, but it's the medication that goes along with it that makes them unmotivated and sluggish and unable to, like you said earlier, hold down a job.
And at your facility, if a patient is being violent, say, towards staff, how do you handle it? What's the protocol?
Our protocol basically is to get assistance from other wards. It is restraint and inject them, because that's the easiest and quickest way to get anything into them, and restrain them till they've calmed down. That's if they're extremely violent. A lot of the time we can try and talk them down and get them to take oral medication. Doesn't always work, but we try that first. That's our first instance. But if somebody's extremely violent, it's just to put a call out to get assistance from other wards and get them injected as quick as possible and get them in their room.
Yeah, no doubt that's the setback in their recovery. In terms of taking the steps towards getting release, what are the milestones that they have to reach in order to get to that point where they can go out to the community?
It depends how long they've been in for. If we've got somebody at the moment who's ready to be released back into the community, so he's having day passes that he'll go into the local town for a day. His next step's an overnight pass, so he'll go back maybe to his parents for an overnight. Then occupational health and the community mental health team will come in, take him back to his own flat, take him shopping, things like that. So they do it to them it seems long. They're ready, they want out into the community, but we don't want them to fail. So we do it in small steps, baby steps all the way, and they will get there.
Yeah, and we talked earlier about myths and misconceptions and stereotypes. What depiction, say in a movie, have you seen of schizophrenia that you consider to be the most accurate?
What was that, sorry?
Yeah, I was just wondering, have you ever seen a movie where schizophrenia was portrayed in a realistic manner? Like, how about something like A Beautiful Mind? Did you see that movie?
Nah, I haven't. To be honest, I haven't watched. I'm not a great telly.
Oh, well, yeah, that movie depicted.
Unfortunately.
Well, do they ever have visual hallucinations, like they can see the person that's talking to them?
Yeah, definitely. We have that all the time. They can see, they see things in their bedrooms. They're convinced that they've got beasties in their bedrooms, that they've got rats running about their floor, or that they've got a cat in their room. They can hear it, they can see it. That's not there, but to them it is, and it's as real as my dog that's sitting next to me. That's what they see is real. The things that they hear, they are as real as a normal conversation. Sometimes they have, it's a bit less common, but sort of tactile hallucinations where they feel bugs running all over them. And that is a really distressing thing to watch. To watch somebody who feels that their skin is crawling with bugs.
And how do you convince them that that this is a symptom of your illness? It's not really there.
You can't convince anyone that it's not there, because to them it is. It is just, we will give them some medication to help bring them down a wee bit, calm them down, try and get them settled so they can go to sleep, so they can get rid of this feeling, because they can wake up in the morning and they won't have that any longer. It's not a constant. It just comes in little spells.
Yeah, I once worked as a dispatcher for a security company, and the same guy called in every night saying somebody was like trying to jimmy open his door, rattling the doorknob, and it was night after night, and he was always convinced it was happening, and we'd send the security guard there, and nobody was there. And
yep, that's right. I mean, they are what they see and what they hear. Even what they smell, they'll tell you that there's gas in the room, or that they can smell fire, they can smell smoke. It's not, but you can't convince them otherwise. And we've had times that we've had to take a patient out of their room and let them sleep in the lounge because they believed that there was gas leaking into their room. Now it's electric heating in the hospital, so there's no gas there. But yet you cannot convince them otherwise.
And I gather that when someone stops taking their medication and the symptoms come back, it actually damages their brain even more, and then it becomes even worse than before. Is that true?
Yeah. I think when people come back in, they do seem worse than what they were at the last time. They're more crisis. You would expect them to get better a wee bit quicker because they've still got medication in their system, but no, it seems to be the people are coming back. It's a longer admission every time.
And so even though they might get rid of the hallucinations and they might be able to get to normal somewhat, are there always going to be manifestations of the illness of something like schizophrenia? Are there some symptoms that can never be completely erased? I'm not sure about that. I don't really know. Once they leave us and go into the community, we don't get to hear about them again until they're back in. However, when I did work in the community in the shared accommodation, these gentlemen, their medication was managed. They were managed by a 24-hour supported accommodation. We were there all the time. But these were they never lost. They still believed there was things there. We had one gentleman who watched telly in 1980-something, and a TVAM presenter, she lost her baby to cot death. For 34 years until he died, he believed that he was the cause of that death because he had watched her that morning on telly. So he was tortured for 34 years, right? Because he never ever lost that thought. And that was him well enough to go into the community. Yeah, a lot of them have that kind of delusion when watching television, thinking the anchor of the 6 o'clock news is speaking directly to them because they are looking right into the camera. It just seems like they are, like it is personal somehow.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. We had a gentleman who had been watching a programme called One Born Every Minute, and it's about babies being born. He was rather round, and he refused his medication because he thought that he was now pregnant. But it was just because he'd been watching that programme, and the women were pregnant, so his delusions told him he was pregnant, and he was going to refuse all medication.
Yeah, my girlfriend was telling me about a woman she knows who's schizophrenic. For the most part, the symptoms are managed. She's not hallucinating, but she says she's still a pretty quirky gal. She's still pretty eccentric.
Oh, aye. Yeah. They do have aye, definitely. They've got some unusual personalities.
Yeah, that's for sure. Well, thank you very much for speaking with us today. I appreciate you giving us your input.
Yeah, you too. Nice speaking to you. Thank you.
Take care. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Right, bye.
And now my interview with Australian Ryan Welsh, who has had his own struggles with mental illness for most of his life. So yeah, this episode is actually somewhat global because I'm here in Canada and I'm doing a true crime case about a guy who's from America, and I spoke to a lady from Scotland yesterday. And so now speaking to you in beautiful Australia. So good day. And I'm going to be doing my first mukbang on Vegemite, by the way. So that should be an interesting experience for me.
Oh, if you haven't Vegemite, mate, you got to put it with a lot of butter.
Oh, with butter, yeah.
Yeah, on bread with butter, like probably more butter than Vegemite, just a little bit of Vegemite.
Well, I gather if you didn't grow up eating it, it's quite an unpleasant experience. But I'm gonna.
Oh, it's quite a strong flavour, mate.
Yeah, it's just pure yeast, right?
Yeah, it's a bit of an acquired taste.
All right, so I'm gonna dive right into it. So yeah, Ryan Welsh has joined us, and he has a personal history with schizophrenia. He was diagnosed as such. And the first thing I want to ask you, how old were you when the symptoms began to appear, and what was the nature of the symptoms?
When I got diagnosed with schizophrenia, because now I'm diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So basically, the schizoaffective disorder is like a person with bipolar who has a tendency to have schizophrenic episodes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, but when I got diagnosed with schizophrenia, it was when I was about 19, 20.
Oh, really? And
Yeah.
so what kind of problems did that present for you?
Oh, I went absolutely insane and ended up in a mental facility.
And how long did it take for you to get to a point of recovery for that?
I'm still recovering because what actually brought on the symptoms was do you remember the synthetic drugs that were out for a long time?
They made synthetic drugs for people with this condition?
No. They made synthetic drugs just for people to take drugs.
Oh, it was like street drugs, you mean?
Yeah, but they were sold at the tobacconist and at sex shops and stuff. They were legal in Australia.
Oh, I see.
Like bath salt type things.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that can
Yeah,
trigger those kinds of symptoms, can't they?
Yeah. So I was taking synthetic cocaine and synthetic marijuana.
Yeah.
But
and
and it set me off.
Oh, I see. Yeah, because they can counteract the effects of medication like diazepam. Did you ever take anything like that?
Yeah. I'm currently medicated for with Abilify.
And so, yeah, one thing I know that comes up for a lot of people who have these kinds of conditions is, prejudice. There's that inevitable moment when you befriend someone, you get to know somebody, and you're going to reveal that you have this history. How do they tend to react? Do people ghost you, or do they say rude things, or what do they tend to do?
Well, it's not the first thing that I would tell someone,
Hmm.
but you do find there is some ghosting. But one thing that I've found is it's very easy for people to gaslight you when you have this history.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah. So they just tell you you're mental, you're insane. When in fact they're just gaslighting you.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, and
Yeah.
one thing I was discussing with a Scottish lady was that getting employed can be difficult because mental illness, especially if you're going through a stressful experience, that can activate all the symptoms, and it can make it difficult to function at work. Um, and then, depending on the workplace, you may be reluctant to disclose that was the reason why maybe you had gaps in your work history. Are you currently employed?
Yeah, I'm currently employed. I've only been working for about 6 weeks.
Oh yeah, what are you doing?
I'm just doing civil labouring, constructing a new estate, the
Oh,
subdivision and roads and stuff.
so have you disclosed to your current employer?
No, I haven't.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess is that the way you prefer to keep it? You just feel like it's not their business anyway.
Yeah, well, it's definitely a confidentiality thing. If they ask me, I'd tell them, but it's just not. Oh, it's not particularly asked, and if they do ask, I often say no anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, no one wants a schizophrenic around. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that is unfortunately true.
Yeah.
Do you ever experience symptoms while you're working?
Depends what sort of state I'm in.
Yeah.
Um, often when I'm doing things, I won't experience any symptoms
Yeah.
when I'm active. But I do sometimes. My schizophrenia isn't necessarily bad. In per se, like I don't have voices telling me to kill people or anything. I just have voices telling me pretty much to fix up my life.
Is that right? Really? So they're
Yeah,
trying.
yeah.
And so when you go through stress, does that tend to cause the symptoms to come to the fore? Is that when it gets worse?
Um, Define stress. Like, what sort of stress situation are you talking about?
It could be any kind, I guess. I mean, it could be something in your personal life. It could be like financial
Yeah,
stress, any
yeah,
situation where, because it seems to me, and I've had my own history with mental illness, is that I don't know. I mean, I won't speak for you. I just find it difficult to deal with chaos, um, or being, stretched to and fro when I have no control over my life. I guess that's how I would define stress for myself. I don't
yeah,
know.
yeah, yeah. When there's a no control situation, often I do gather. Um, I do get some symptoms to of what I should do and what I shouldn't do.
Hmm.
I haven't had any visual hallucinations, or I don't believe they're hallucinations that I have. But I haven't had any visual schizophrenic episodes for about a year now.
Oh, I
So
see.
that yeah. So it's I've sort of got it under control. Once it gets visual, it's a bit much.
And have you do you ever? So, is the medication really working at this point? Is it keeping all the symptoms at bay?
It's it is, but I hate taking it because it puts on fat. It makes you lethargic, and you
Yeah, that's
just yeah. It's a dead set downer.
yes. I have heard about that. A lot of people stop taking it because they don't like the side effects, but yet,
Yep.
but on the other hand, of course, not taking it means facing even more severe consequences.
It,
So
it, it can.
catch
It can.
22. Yeah, it's the catch-22, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely catch-22.
And so whenever you were in these institutions, how long did it take you to get to a point where you could leave, where you could reach certain milestones that would enable you to get on an even footing and live a normal life again?
I've been in institutions about over 10 times, and the most time I've spent in there is 6 weeks, which is the longest I could schedule you for if you don't have anywhere to go.
Mm-hmm.
Unless they deem you completely mad, then they can send you to the permanent asylum.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, have
Yeah.
you been involuntarily committed? Like someone?
Yes. I was originally committed by the police.
Oh, I see. So
Yeah.
were there violent incidents? Is that why they took you there?
Yeah. Well, pretty much. They were, as you know, schizophrenia. You can believe things that aren't true and make up sort of your own things in your head.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, pretty much. I was in the police station, and at that stage I was like 20 years old, and I thought everyone who went to jail got raped.
Mm-hmm.
That is what I assumed at the time. I just imagined that was true, and which I've been jailed since then, and that is not true, by the way. So I pretty much just flipped right out because I was just not wanting to go to jail. I was hearing voices, and yeah, he said flip out, you know what I mean? So I just got naked and just started headbutting the perspex, split me head open. They said this bloke's just mental, and they sent me off to the mental institution.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I know that you said you have schizoid affective disorder.
So
Or
effective.
so effective, yeah. So,
Yeah.
but there tends to be quite a lot of overlap in terms of symptoms, right?
Yeah, they can be. With schizoaffective, it's so with schizophrenic, they're suffering these symptoms all the time.
Yeah,
You understand?
yeah.
Like I was I've been in mental health wards, I've been in mental health parts of jail, and there's people who in rehabs, and there's people who are just hearing voices 24/7.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I've been through episodes where I've heard voices, and I go through episodes where I hear voices, and I see things, but I don't act. I'm not actually always going through them episodes.
So, are you always um, cognizant of the fact that these are symptoms of an illness, that it's not real, that it's just?
Well, I'm firm on that that it is real, and that it's ghosts,
Yeah.
because I've seen it myself. I originally it was I had voices that I didn't know where they were coming from, man. I thought they were in the roof. I'm running around in the roof looking for people in the roof. I went off at the neighbours behind me. I didn't even know, because I thought that might have been them. And eventually I just heard them when I was in the house. I opened the back door, and I've just yelled out, just come in. Because I thought it was the neighbours behind me. Come in, come in, you cunt. And this bloke just come running in, man, screaming. And I've covered up. I thought, when he jumps me, I'll flip him. And I thought, wait up, I've had too much time to think about this. And then I looked up, and there was just a person above me, frozen, while I was lying on the lounge. And as I got up, I looked on this looked. I've looked at him, and I looked to the side of him, and I couldn't see him anymore. It was like cardboard cutout. So he was 3D from the front, and from the side he was I couldn't see him. And then I looked at him from the back, and he had a bunch of lashes over his back like an ex-convict.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, and as you know, Australia was discovered by the convicts, and yeah. Then from that point, I just didn't know what was going on. Then it flashed back to the point where he popped up in the because they come through a blue light. There's this blue light I come from. So this blue light popped up and he flashed back to there and ran to the same spot 3 times. And I've watched it. And then he's dropped and faded away into nothing. That was the first visual episode that I had.
Wow. Do you have
Yeah.
do you also have like maybe olfactory hallucinations where you smell things that are not there?
No. I can't say I've had any smell hallucinations.
Mm-hmm.
I've
Or
actually never heard. That's an interesting one.
was there ever anything? One thing some people experience is that they'll be like watching the TV and they think like the news anchor is talking directly at them because they do look into the camera, but they believe
Yeah.
if it's a personalized thing, it's the.
Yeah, sometimes when I'm going through episodes, I hear things and I think that they are for me. I think that they're aiming this at me, and it's like a government setup where they're focusing in on me because I've had these spiritual experiences and I like this is my own psychotic thinking, and I'm a strong spirit, and they're aiming directing things at me. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I have that, but I've never looked at a TV and thought that the person was looking me in the eye. I can't say that.
And so, what are some other aspects of having this condition that has made your life hard?
Um. Oh, it's just the mainly the assumption, a lot of assumptions and things like I'll see visions in my head that of things happening, but it's just my imagination. But when I'm going through my episodes, I believe these things have happened and I can visually see them. So I'm accusing people of things that they've never done, and
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
100% believing it.
And have you do you have any artistic talents? Have you ever tried to draw these things or express them in writing or anything like that?
No, not particularly. I'm not much of an artist. No,
Yeah.
yeah, I've done a couple of paintings and that, but I've never tried to express this sort of stuff in artistic form. No.
Yeah, it's a common thing among like a lot of creative people where they suffer from mental illness and but not everyone, of course, has that condition.
Yeah, yeah. I love to sing and I don't mind painting and that, but I'm just not that artistically talented, to be honest.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Is it genetic at all? Does anyone else in your family have psychiatric conditions?
Um. Well, like my auntie when her son died through um he got choked by a stroller.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and she went a bit mad, but not as far as I'm aware.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I do have deep connections into very high spiritual people,
Mm-hmm.
uh, like family bloodline to very high spiritual people. So um so that's where I think that sort of comes from because I think that it's more of a psychic thing than a psychotic thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, but this is my belief, and I'm the one with it. So I've got to look at it the most positive way I can.
And have you another career in mind someday that you'd like to try?
A career?
Yeah.
Yeah, like I don't know. I'm just a labourer really at the moment, but it doesn't really feel like me. I'd like to get into possibly I don't mind combat sports and that. I used to box when I was young. I should have kept that going and just tried to do that as a career. But I don't know, just something to help people. I wouldn't mind helping people.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I wonder if mental illness is something that would hinder somebody in athletics. You know, I wonder how you would have done if you had pursued that.
yeah. Well, that's exactly right. I get very down with a loss.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that might have been a bit of an affected me a bit, but yeah, I'm not too sure.
Well, you know, it can really make mental illness can really make a mess of your life. You can end up with a lot of regrets about how you handled certain things or how you didn't do certain things. Is that something you struggle with as well? How because of your condition, things didn't turn out as well you would have liked, or you saw dreams kind of go down the drain.
Yeah. 100%. My life's full of regrets. I was on 90 grand a year at 19 years old, and now and I've never made as much money since because I got on the drugs and I literally set myself insane.
Mm,
You know what I mean?
yeah. So
Yeah. So I've seen my own life go down the drain. I was a super fit, um, young guy with an awesome job, but I just things went down the drain very fast. My life's full of regrets.
did you? Well, so what? How was your mental health before you started doing the drugs?
Um, well, I'll say I was medicated from the age of 6 for with dexamphetamine.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so I have. They call me the umbrella. They've diagnosed me with everything that you can be diagnosed with. Every
Wait,
mental health.
was ADHD one of them?
Yeah. ADHD is one of them. I've got ADHD, OCD, ODD. They've diagnosed with slight autism, bipolar. Oh, what else? Schizoaffective, schizophrenia, psychosis. Um, there's more. Is there any more mental health things you can think? Or anxiety. Um, they even threw in antisocial disorder.
Hmm.
Uh yeah, that's as far as I could name at the moment. Like I've been diagnosed with everything you can possibly think of.
Well, you know, ADHD was overdiagnosed for a long time, and
Yes.
they just basically it was just boys being boys. Boys are boisterous. They like to roughhouse, and they decided to medicate it. And then by medicating it, they ended up damaging a whole generation of young males, and then that led to other psychiatric conditions and more pills. And so that's really kind of a tragic thing when you think about it.
Yeah, well, that's what's happened to me. As That's exactly what's happened to me. Like I despise my parents for medicating me. Which yeah, like I have a great mum, but the fact I was medicated, I think it ruined my life. It changed me as a person.
Hmm.
It changed who I was and changed my whole trajectory, and it pretty much made me not who I am. And I just want to be who I originally was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know, there are these trends in parenting and childcare that come and go, and I'm sure your parents, you know, they were probably told that that was the thing to do. I'm sure they had your best interests in mind.
Yeah.
They were like so many millions of other parents, were just say, you know, put them on Ritalin, and uh, and then that'll straighten them out, and they'll end up better off. And but then, yeah, like I said, the children end up with being bipolar or borderline or something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Because if you actually look up studies, methamphetamine versus dexamphetamine. They done studies on rats comparing them, and they have the exact same effect on the brain. Just that methamphetamine is slightly more damaging on the brain than dexamphetamine. And this is on a developing brain they're feeding it to every day.
God.
So you can imagine the damage it done, which is why I believe that as everyone knows, or a lot of people know, if you're medicated as a kid, you can't take drugs because it'll fuck you up. And that's what I did. Because they literally fry you as a kid. And
Yeah.
then you get then if you take drugs when you're older, you're at that point where you just snap. You're already drug fucked.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I'm a big advocate of not medicating children.
No, I mean it's just they don't know how to educate boys. Boys don't like to sit still. They don't like, to be talked at. They would probably learn better through interactive education. I mean, I know I would have. I hated sitting down. Unfortunately, I wasn't given Ritalin, or I wasn't diagnosed as ADHD. But yeah, I think. How old are you, by the way?
I'm 31.
31. Yeah, so I think you're a millennial, I guess. So your generation definitely was given all the propaganda about ADHD.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
I mean, if dead set with the way I've lived my life, like what I've went through on that, if this was back in the 80s, they would have given me a bloody lobotomy by now.
That's possible. Yeah, they used to do
Yeah,
that.
yeah. What I'm going through, like, I feel like it's torture by psychiatry.
Mm-hmm.
I think psychiatry is still a very torturous industry. They're like, with this medication that I'm on with the schizophrenia, I don't have schizophrenic episodes really unless I get on drugs.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they're literally making me fat and lethargic just to punish me for going psychotic.
Well, the problem with taking that approach, though it's not problematic for them, of course, is that it's easier, it's faster to put someone on pills than it is to bring them in for therapy and help them sort things out that way. But that said, there is quite
I'm not on pills. I'm on a forced injection.
Oh, you're taking the injection, yeah.
Yeah, I know. I'm forced to take the injection.
Oh, yeah. Does that last a few weeks?
No, it lasts a month, and if I don't take my injection every month, the police show up.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm they're forcibly injecting me.
Wow. Is that
Yeah.
is that like does that injection go in the butt?
Yeah, in the butt. It's a muscular injection.
Wow. So does that, and what kind of, and that still has side effects after all this time?
Yeah. It puts on weight, and I need about 12 hours sleep a night, honestly, with the injection.
Wow. Oh, so
I
you right.
will smoke meth just to live my life because I can't function on this injection.
So it's right after the injection, or do you feel that way all the time? Do you
All
always?
the time because they've constantly got me injected with it.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a funny thing. Yeah, I know. It's like, well, yeah, and if all you're gonna do is sleep and work and eat, I guess, yeah, you are gonna gain some weight for sure.
Yeah, and the medication makes you put on weight, and I believe it makes you like want high calorie foods.
Oh, is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, it makes you hungry too.
Or maybe it doesn't make you crave Vegemite, does it?
No, it doesn't make you crave Vegemite. But I'm telling you, a lot of butter if you're having the Vegemite.
Yeah, actually, well, seems like I should just take it straight because I want to get the whole experience. So
Yeah. All right, I dare you to eat a spoonful of Vegemite in one hit.
yeah, maybe I'll go about it that way.
I wouldn't suggest it.
Yeah. An Australian did tell me that if you're going to spread it straight, just spread it thin.
Yeah. I'd suggest it on toast with butter.
Toast them with butter. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Just if you're gonna try it straight, just try a little bit straight, and then just try it on toast with butter. Toast with butter.
Well, thanks for that advice, because otherwise maybe I'd end up in a psych ward after eating it too much, All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing your experience today, Ryan. And I appreciate that. I appreciate your honesty and your courage, because I know it's from my own experience. It's not easy to talk about these things, especially if you're a guy, because, of all the bad press men have about opening up about these things, the fear of being perceived as weak, the fear of being perceived as flawed. But there is an increased conversation about men's mental health, and you've contributed to that very well today.
All right. Thank you very much for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for the interview, man. I'll let you know when I publish it. Take care.
All right. Thank you very much. All right.
Yeah.
Bye.
Good night. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.